You are the one who shows up every time. Not because anyone asked twice. Not because you needed to be convinced. You remember the things other people forget. You notice when someone's having a hard week. You give more than is expected of you, and somehow you've trained yourself to expect less back. And here's the part that doesn't make sense. The people you give the most to are the ones who seem to see you the least. You felt it, that specific, quiet ache of being everywhere in someone's life and invisible in their attention. It isn't cruelty. If it were cruelty, you could point at it, name it, fight it. It's quieter than that, stranger than that, and underneath it, there's a question you probably haven't said out loud. What is it about me that makes this keep happening? That question deserves a real answer, not guilt, not self-blame. An answer built on actual psychology. Because once you understand the mechanism behind this, it stops feeling like a character flaw and starts feeling like something you can finally change. Chapter 1. The Cost of Looking Easy. Here's something no one warned you about: being dependable. The easier you make something look, the less anyone thinks it costs you. This isn't a guess. It's how attention works. Your brain is built to notice change, not consistency. It fires for the unexpected. It goes quiet for the constant. Think about your own heartbeat. You don't feel grateful for it. You don't even notice it until, for one terrifying second, it skips. That's what happens to you in other people's minds. When you're always available, always steady, always the one who absorbs the hard thing without flinching, you don't register as generous anymore. You register as background, not because you stopped mattering, because you stopped looking like something that could ever run out. This is the part that stings the most. The smoother you make your sacrifice look, the less anyone clocks it as sacrifice at all. You paid a cost, but you paid it so quietly, so gracefully, that the bill never got sent, and bills that never get sent never get paid back. This is the invisible tax on every reliable person. You pay it every time you make something difficult look effortless, every time you swallow the inconvenience instead of naming it, every time your face doesn't change even though something inside you did. Effortless is the most dangerous thing you can appear to be, because things that appear to cost nothing don't get appreciated, they get taken. Think about the specific moments this shows up in your life. The extra hour you stay to help a coworker finish something that was never your responsibility. The time you rearranged your entire weekend because someone else needed you, and you didn't want to make them feel bad for asking. The conversation where you said, "It's totally fine," when it wasn't fine at all, and you said it so smoothly that nobody thought to double-check. Every one of those moments felt, in the instant, like the generous thing to do. And it was generous. That's not in question. But generosity that never shows its own weight teaches people a very specific lesson without either of you ever agreeing to it, that this is simply what you're like, not something you chose, something you are, a trait rather than a decision. And traits don't get thanked. Decisions do. The difference matters more than it sounds like it should. When someone perceives your kindness as a decision, something you actively chose to do, at a cost for them specifically, it lands as a gift. When they perceive it as a trait, something you would have done for anyone, in any circumstance, because that's simply your nature, it lands as weather. Nobody sends a thank you card for a sunny day. This is why you can do something enormous for someone and receive almost no reaction, while someone else does something comparatively small and gets showered with gratitude. It was never really about the size of the act. It was about whether the act was perceived as costing the giver something real in that specific moment for that specific person. You've been giving real things. You've just been giving them so gracefully that no one clocked the price tag. Chapter 2. Where you learned to disappear. This didn't start with the people currently overlooking you. It started earlier, long before them, somewhere back in your first relationships, the ones that taught you what love required. You picked up a lesson, quietly, without anyone stating it directly. The lesson was this: being easy was safer than being honest. Maybe asking for things got you an eye roll. Maybe needing too much got you distance instead of comfort. Maybe the version of you that caused no trouble was the version that got kept close, while the version that had needs got treated like a burden. So you adapted, because that's what children do. They read the room and they adjust to survive it. You got small, you got convenient, you got extraordinarily good at needing less than you actually needed, and it worked. It kept the peace. It earned you approval that honesty never seemed to. So you brought that skill into every relationship since, minimizing yourself, maximizing your usefulness, making yourself easy to love by making yourself easy to overlook. And the people around you did exactly what people do with anything that requires no maintenance. They stopped maintaining it, not out of cruelty, out of habit, the same habit you taught them, one quiet accommodation at a time. Here's what makes this so hard to see clearly from the inside. The lesson you learned as a child didn't arrive as a sentence you could examine and reject. It arrived as a feeling, a small, wordless certainty that showed up before you had language for it, a tightening in your chest when you thought about asking for something, a flush of shame at the idea of being too much, a relief, almost physical, when you managed to need nothing from anyone. That feeling became your compass, and compasses don't announce themselves as compasses. They just quietly point, and you follow, assuming the direction they're pointing in is simply the direction that's true. So you followed it into adulthood, into friendships where you became the one who never brought up problems first, into romantic relationships where you became the one who adjusted around everyone else's schedule, everyone else's mood, everyone else's needs, while quietly hoping someone would eventually think to ask about yours, into workplaces where you became the person managers could hand anything to because you would find a way to make it work and you would never make it their problem if it didn't. Every one of those environments rewarded the exact same skill your childhood taught you to develop, and every reward reinforced the belief underneath it. This is how you keep people. This is how you stay safe. This is how you matter. The tragedy isn't that the belief was completely wrong. In the environment where you first learned it, it may have been the smartest available strategy, the one that got you through. The tragedy is that a strategy built for survival in one specific environment got mistaken for a permanent truth about how all relationships have to work. And you've been running that old survival software in relationships that were never actually as dangerous as the one that first installed it. Chapter 3. The Widening Gap. There's a name for what happens next. Psychologists call it the gratitude gap, the growing distance between how much you give and how much anyone notices you're giving it. Here's how it grows. At the start of anything, a friendship, a relationship, a job, your generosity is new. It stands out. It gets a reaction, but repetition kills reaction. The 10th time you show up early costs you exactly as much as the first time, but the 10th time doesn't register the same way. It's been filed under "this is just how they are," and things filed under "just how they are" stop generating thanks. They start generating expectation. Here's the cruelest twist. Trying harder makes the gap worse, not better, because the harder you work to be appreciated, the more available you become, the more forgiving, the more willing to absorb without a word, which trains the pattern even deeper. The exact strategy that feels like it should fix this, giving more, proving more, being more, is the strategy quietly making you more invisible. There's a reason this feels so counterintuitive, almost unfair. In nearly every other area of life, more effort produces more result. Study more, learn more, practice more, improve more, work more, earn more. So it makes sense that your instinct, when you notice you're being overlooked, is to apply the same logic here. Give more, and surely, eventually, someone will notice. But relationships don't run on the same math as skill building. They run on perception, and perception has a ceiling. Once someone's brain has categorized you as the reliable one, additional reliability doesn't raise the category. It just gets folded into the existing one. You could double your effort tomorrow, and from the outside, it would barely register as a change at all, because the baseline against which they're measuring you has already absorbed everything you were doing before. This is the part that quietly breaks people. Not the lack of appreciation itself, but the exhausting discovery that trying harder inside the same pattern produces diminishing returns, then no returns, then in some cases a kind of quiet punishment, because Because the more you give, the more available you appear, and the more available you appear, the more your limits get tested to see where they actually are. If you've ever felt like you were running faster and faster on a treadmill that never changed speed, this is why. You weren't imagining the effort, you were just spending it inside a frame that was never built to reward more of the same thing. Chapter 4. The resentment you don't talk about. At some point, it turns into resentment. Not loud. You're not the type to make a scene. Quiet. Living in the space between what you give and what comes back. Sitting there while you do the same thing for the 100th time, wondering if anyone would even notice if you just stopped. And then guilt shows up right behind the resentment. Because you weren't supposed to need recognition. You chose this. Keeping score isn't who you are. So you push it back down, the same way you push everything down. But suppressed things don't disappear. They leak out sideways, a slightly cooler tone, a little less availability than usual, a flicker of resignation in your voice that wasn't there before. And here's what's fascinating. The people who never noticed your effort suddenly notice its absence. They don't say, "Thank you for everything you've done." They say, "You seem different lately," which tells you something important. You were never actually invisible to them. You were expected. And expectation notices absence far faster than it notices presence. That's not just painful, that's useful. That's information you can work with. There's another layer to this resentment worth naming, because it's rarely talked about honestly. It isn't only resentment toward the people who overlook you. Some of it, if you're honest, is resentment toward yourself for staying quiet as long as you did, for not saying something sooner, for training people so thoroughly that this now feels like an uphill battle rather than a simple correction. That self-directed resentment is worth examining gently rather than believing completely. Yes, your silence played a role in building this pattern, but silence built under the belief that speaking up would cost you something. Connection, safety, approval isn't a character flaw. It's a reasonable response to a reasonable fear, even if the fear turned out to be based on old information rather than current reality. The goal here isn't to punish your past self for adapting the way she or he did. The goal is to notice clearly and without shame that the adaptation has outlived its usefulness. What kept you safe once is now the exact thing keeping you invisible. That's not a failure. That's just a strategy reaching the end of its shelf life. And every strategy, no matter how well it once worked, eventually needs to be replaced by something built for the situation you're actually in now, not the one you were in when you first built it. Chapter 5. Why some people never get overlooked. Why do some people move through life getting genuine appreciation while others, people who give just as much, sometimes more, stay perpetually unseen? It has almost nothing to do with how much they give. It has everything to do with how they hold what they give. People who consistently get appreciated tend to do three specific things differently. First, they aren't always available. Not from coldness, from having an actual life outside of being useful to someone. When they show up, it reads as a choice, and chosen presence gets treated completely differently than expected presence. Available things get used. Occasionally, available things get valued. This isn't a call to become deliberately scarce, playing games with your presence to manufacture value the way a marketer might manufacture scarcity around a product. That approach is hollow, and people tend to sense hollowness eventually, even when they can't name it. What actually creates this effect is far more honest. Having a real life, real limits, and real commitments that occasionally, genuinely take precedence over being available to everyone else. The scarcity isn't performed. It's simply the natural result of a person who has stopped treating their own time as infinitely negotiable. Second, they let the cost be visible, not through complaining, through honesty. When something is hard, they don't hide the difficulty behind a calm face. They let it show. Gratitude requires evidence that something was actually given at a price. Hide the price, and you erase the evidence. Third, they let people feel the consequence of their absence, not as punishment, as information. When they step back, even briefly, from something they've quietly been carrying, other people finally discover what was being carried. Discovery, even the uncomfortable kind, is what ends in visibility. Notice something important about all three of these behaviors. behaviors. None of them require becoming a different person. None of them require coldness, manipulation, or strategic withholding of genuine care. They require something much simpler and much harder, letting the truth of your actual experience be visible instead of constantly managed and smoothed over on everyone else's behalf. The people who never get overlooked aren't secretly colder than you. In many cases, they're just as warm, just as giving, just as capable of showing up for the people they love. The difference is that their warmth comes with texture. It has edges. It has a no somewhere in its history, which makes every yes mean something. It has moments of visible cost, which makes every act of generosity legible as generosity instead of disappearing into the background noise of "that's just how they are." You don't need to import a whole new personality to get this result. You need to stop editing out the parts of your actual experience, the tiredness, the effort, the occasional unavailability, the real cost of what you give that have been quietly making you seem like an inexhaustible resource instead of a full, limited, real person. Chapter 6. The Trap of Trying Harder. You've probably already tried to fix this, given more, communicated more clearly, had the hard conversation, explained exactly how it felt, hoped that saying it out loud would finally change something, and maybe it did. For a week, 2 weeks, then the old pattern crept back in. Here's why. The mistake isn't in the effort, it's in the direction of the effort. When you try to fix being overlooked by giving more, explaining more, softening more, you're still operating inside the exact frame that created the problem. You're still the one whose strategy is to increase your own output and hope someone else's behavior changes in response. But behavior doesn't shift because you gave them more of you. It shifts because their experience of the relationship changes, which means your behavior has to change, not toward more, toward different. The different that actually works is this: you stop being predictable, not unreliable, not cold, just no longer automatic. The person who's always available becomes someone who's sometimes available. The person who always absorbs becomes someone who occasionally doesn't. The person who never complains says one true uncomfortable thing out loud. This will feel wrong at first. It will feel like you're abandoning who you are. You're not. You're recalibrating a relationship that quietly drifted out of balance, and recalibration only happens when it starts with the person who has the power to change the baseline. That's always been you. It's worth being honest about what the early stages of this recalibration actually feel like, because nobody warns you and the surprise can shake your confidence right when you need it most. The first time you say no to something you'd normally say yes to, it will not feel empowering. It will feel like you've done something wrong. Your stomach will drop. You'll want to immediately follow it with an explanation, an apology, an offer to make it up to them somehow. Resist that urge, or at least notice it clearly when it shows up. That discomfort isn't a signal that you've made a mistake. It's the physical sensation of a pattern being interrupted, the same sensation anyone feels when they change a habit that's been running on autopilot for years. It fades, not immediately but reliably, the more times you let the new behavior stand without rushing to undo it. And be prepared for the specific reaction that often comes from the people most used to your old pattern. Mild confusion, maybe a little pushback, sometimes an accusation that you're being different or acting distant. This reaction doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means the people around you are recalibrating their own expectations in real time, and recalibration is rarely smooth on either side. Consistency, not comfort, is what tells you whether the new pattern is working. Chapter 7. What self-respect actually sounds like. There's a version of this advice that gets repeated so often it's basically background noise now. Know your worth. Set boundaries. Stop letting people treat you like this. None of that is wrong. It's just incomplete, because knowing your worth was never the hard part. Most people who feel chronically overlooked already know, somewhere inside, that they deserve better. The hard part is behaving like it in the actual moment, with the actual person, when the old pull toward accommodating feels so much stronger than the abstract idea of deserving more. So what does that actually sound like? It sounds like a pause before you answer, not a cold pause, a real one. Is this something something I want to give, or something I'm giving on autopilot because that's what I always do? It sounds like letting disappointment exist. When you hold a limit and someone's upset about it, you don't rush to undo the limit to fix their feelings. You let the disappointment sit there. Limits that dissolve the second someone's unhappy were never limits. They were suggestions. And it sounds like naming the cost without apologizing for having one. This was hard for me. This has been sitting heavy. I need something different here. That's not a complaint. That's the first honest piece of information you've given this relationship in a long time, because the people around you have only ever met the version of you that hides its own weight. Let them meet the real one. Real things are much harder to take for granted than convenient ones. There's one more piece of this that deserves to be said plainly, because it's often the piece people skip when they talk about self-respect. None of this requires you to become harsh, distant, or difficult to be around. Self-respect isn't the opposite of kindness. It's the container that makes kindness sustainable. Without a container, generosity leaks out in every direction until there's nothing left for the people who actually deserve it, including yourself. With a container, your kindness becomes something you can sustain for years because it's no longer draining you faster than it's being replenished. You can still be the person who shows up. You can still be warm, attentive, and generous with your time and your care. The only difference is that now those things are choices made from a place of genuine willingness rather than automatic reflexes made from fear of what happens if you don't. That distinction, reflex versus choice, is the entire difference between being taken for granted and being genuinely valued. Nobody values a reflex. Everybody eventually comes to value a real choice, made freely by someone who could have said no and didn't. Chapter 8. When the pattern is the whole relationship. Some of what you're living through isn't a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up. It's not a communication gap that closes with the right conversation. It's the relationship itself. Specifically, a relationship built on two patterns that fit together perfectly. Your pattern of giving without limit, their pattern of taking without tracking. Two pieces clicking into a lock. That's why it feels so familiar. It's the exact shape your nervous system was trained to recognize as normal a long time ago. When the pattern is the relationship, better communication won't save it. Only honest assessment will. Does this person show up for you the way you show up for them? Is there real mutuality here, or is the giving structurally one-directional? Has this person ever shown you, through action, not words, that they actually see you? If the honest answers keep pointing the same direction, that's not a coincidence. That's data. Not every relationship is meant to be recalibrated. Some wouldn't survive the honesty required to fix them, and a relationship that can't survive your honesty was never really holding you in the first place. It was holding the quiet, convenient version of you, the one willing to stay invisible to keep the peace. This is uncomfortable to sit with, so let's sit with it a little longer, because rushing past it would do you a disservice. Assessing a relationship honestly does not mean deciding in a single dramatic moment to end it. It means gathering real evidence over time, the same way you'd gather evidence about anything else that mattered to you. Does this person's behavior change even slightly when you express a need? Do they ask about your life with the same curiosity you bring to theirs when you've been honest about something difficult? Did they meet that honesty with care, or did they meet it with defensiveness, minimization, or silence? You're not looking for perfection. Nobody offers perfect reciprocity, and expecting it would set you up to feel disappointed by every relationship you'll ever have, including the good ones. You're looking for direction, for whether the needle, over time, moves toward more mutuality or stays locked in the same place no matter what you try. If the honest answer is that it stays locked, that doesn't necessarily mean the relationship has to end. It might mean the relationship gets a smaller, more protected place in your life, one where your expectations are realistic rather than perpetually disappointed. Sometimes the healthiest move isn't exit, it's recalibrated proximity, staying close enough to preserve what's genuinely good while no longer handing over the parts of yourself that this particular relationship has shown you repeatedly it cannot hold. Chapter 9. Becoming someone who can't be overlooked. Here's what most people get wrong about all of this. The fix isn't getting louder. louder, it isn't getting harder, it isn't shutting off the warmth that's genuinely, actually yours. The fix is becoming more completely yourself. People who get taken for granted have almost always trimmed themselves down, sanded off the edges, made themselves smooth and accommodating and easy to be around by becoming less whole. And incomplete people are easy to miss, not because they're worth less, because they take up less space to push against, less room to be surprised by, less presence to actually reckon with. When you become fully yourself, you take up more space, not aggressively, just honestly. You have opinions and you say them, even when it creates a little friction. You have needs and you name them, even when naming them feels uncomfortable at first. You hold limits even when someone's disappointed by them. You're not available for everything because you're actually invested in specific things. That version of you is much harder to overlook, not because it demands attention, because it's genuinely, unmistakably present. Here's the paradox. Nobody tells you. The people who shrink themselves to be easier to love usually receive the least of it, and the people who take up their full, real space tend to get the recognition the shrinking version spent years chasing and never quite catching. Full presence demands a response. Convenient absence never does. This shift shows up in small, almost unremarkable moments, long before it shows up in anything dramatic. It's the moment you mention a preference at dinner instead of automatically deferring to whatever everyone else wants. It's the moment you let a friend know a plan doesn't work for you instead of rearranging your entire week to make it fit. It's the moment you talk about something that actually excites you at length without immediately checking whether you're taking up too much of the conversation. None of these moments feel significant while they're happening, but they accumulate, and what they accumulate into is a version of you that other people experience as fuller, more textured, more specific, a whole person instead of a helpful function. People remember whole people. They forget functions, the same way you forget the specific chair you sat in during a meeting 3 years ago. Functions blend into the background of a life. Whole people stand out in the foreground of it. You don't need anyone's permission to start becoming that person. You've had the standing to do it the entire time. What changes now is simply your willingness to use it. Chapter 10. The room that gets quiet when you change. Something happens the first time you actually change, and almost nobody talks about it because it doesn't fit the tidy version of this story where you set a boundary and the room applauds. The room doesn't applaud. Often the room goes quiet, not because what you did was wrong, because what you did was unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things make people pause before they know how to respond to them. You say no to something you'd normally absorb, and instead of relief or respect, you might get a beat of silence, a slightly flat, "Oh, okay," a subtle shift in tone that makes you want to immediately backpedal and offer the old, easier version of yourself instead. This is the moment most people quietly retreat. The silence feels like proof that the change was a mistake, that you damaged something, that it would have been easier to just keep absorbing the way you always have. But that silence is not verdict. It's adjustment. You are asking people to update a model of you that took years to build. And models don't update instantly just because new information arrives. They update the way most learning happens, gradually through repeated exposure, until the new pattern finally overwrites the old one as the default expectation. This means the version of you that holds a boundary once and then panics at the awkward silence that follows will likely find the boundary quietly dissolving within the week. And the version of you that holds it again and again calmly, without over-explaining or apologizing for existing, is the version that actually gets to experience life on the other side of that discomfort, the side where the new pattern becomes the new normal and the awkward silence stops showing up at all, because it's no longer new information. It's simply who you become. There's a specific kind of courage required here that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It looks like staying quiet through someone else's confusion instead of rushing to explain yourself into smallness again. It looks like tolerating a slightly colder response for a week or two, trusting that the coldness is temporary friction rather than permanent verdict. Most people give up exactly one step before this friction resolves, which is precisely why the pattern of being overlooked so often persists for years longer than it needs to. Not because change doesn't work, because most people stop practicing it the moment it feels uncomfortable, mistaking discomfort for evidence of failure. Chapter 11. The Grief That Finally Sets You Free. Here's the last hard truth. Some of the people who've taken you for granted are never going to become what you need them to be. Not because they're bad, because they exist at a specific level of awareness, and that level doesn't include the kind of attention and reciprocity you're actually looking for. Waiting for them to finally see you clearly isn't hope. It's the postponement of a grief you've already had access to for a while. The grief of accepting that this particular person cannot give you what you deserve and may never be able to. That grief is real. Let yourself feel it, because on the other side of it is something the waiting never gave you. Clarity. Clarity about who actually shows up, who actually notices, who actually gives back something close to what you give out, and the freedom, finally, to put your extraordinary capacity for care where it's actually met, into the relationships that deserve the version of you who gives everything. Because here's what's been true this entire time. There was never anything wrong with your generosity. Nothing wrong with your reliability, your warmth, your willingness to keep showing up. The only mistake was direction. The giving was never the problem. You were just aiming it at people who never learned how to catch it. Now you know the difference. And knowing the difference is where all of this finally starts to change. Let this settle for a moment, because it's easy to hear something like this and immediately jump to the question of what to do next, which conversation to have, which limit to set first, which relationship to reassess. That instinct isn't wrong, but it can also be another version of the same old pattern, the urge to immediately act, immediately fix, immediately prove that you've absorbed the lesson well enough to be forgiven for needing it in the first place. You don't need to fix anything today. You don't need to have the hard conversation this afternoon or send the message that finally says the honest thing. What you actually need, before any of that, is simpler and slower. The willingness to notice in real time the next moment this pattern shows up, the next time you feel the automatic pull to say yes before you've even asked yourself if you want to, the next time you feel your face smoothing over something that actually hurt, the next time you catch yourself making something difficult look effortless purely out of habit. Noticing is the whole beginning. Everything else, the pause, the honesty, the limit, the visible cost, grows out of that single moment of awareness repeated patiently over and over, until it stops requiring conscious effort and simply becomes how you move through your life. There is no finish line here, no single day when you'll wake up and know definitively that you've arrived at being fully seen. This is not a problem you solve once. It's a relationship with yourself that you tend to for the rest of your life, the same steady, patient way you've always tended to everyone else's needs. The only difference now is where that attention finally gets pointed, toward yourself, at last, where it always deserved to go. And if you take nothing else from everything you've just heard, take this. The fact that you've made it this far, listening closely enough to recognize yourself in every chapter, is itself evidence of exactly the kind of self-awareness this whole shift requires. People who are incapable of change don't usually sit with content like this long enough to feel it land. You did, which means the hardest part, seeing the pattern clearly, without flinching away from it, is already behind you. Everything from here is simply practice. Practice, not perfection. There will be moments you slip back into the old habit without noticing until it's already happened. A yes given automatically, a hurt swallowed instead of spoken, a difficult thing made to look effortless out of sheer muscle memory. When that happens, resist the urge to treat it as proof that nothing has really changed. One slip doesn't erase 100 small corrections. It's simply the old pattern reasserting itself the way any long-held habit occasionally will. And the appropriate response isn't self-punishment. It's a quiet return to the practice, the very next chance you get. That's the whole shape of this work. Notice, pause, choose honestly, let the discomfort pass without abandoning the choice. Repeat gently for as long as it takes, which, for most people doing this seriously, turns out to be the rest of their lives in the best possible sense, because a life spent finally being seen, rather than merely relied upon, is worth every uncomfortable rehearsal it takes to get there. This won't resolve resolve in a single conversation, and it doesn't need to. Patterns this old were never going to unwind from one moment of insight. They unwind slowly, through dozens of small, deliberate choices. The pause before automatically saying yes, the honest sentence instead of the swallowed one, the limit that gets to stand even when someone's disappointed by it. Some of those choices will feel easy almost immediately. Others, especially with the people who've known the old version of you the longest, will feel like relearning a language you thought you already spoke fluently. Both are normal. Neither means you're doing this wrong. Change in this area rarely moves in a straight line. It moves forward, drifts back a little under old pressure, and then moves forward again, a bit steadier than before. What waits on the other side is worth every uncomfortable step it takes to get there. Relationships that finally reflect the whole truth of who you are, instead of a smoothed over, convenient edit of you that never needed anything and never seemed to tire. That edited version kept things running for a long time, but it was never sustainable, and it was never really you. The real you gets tired sometimes, has limits, has preferences, has days where showing up costs something real, and the real you deserves relationships built around being met, not just relationships built around being relied upon. The people capable of meeting that real, whole version of you are the ones worth building the rest of your life around. Everyone else was only ever in relationship with the role you used to play, not the person standing underneath it, and letting that difference finally come into focus isn't a loss. It's the moment your life starts belonging to you again.